Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Oregon Conservation Partnership webinar on stitching together pollinator habitat initiatives across Oregon. I hope everyone was able to get on okay and that you can hear us and that we don't have any technical difficulties. My name is Vanessa Green. I'm the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, and I will be serving as the facilitator today and keeping an eye on your questions and leading the discussion. This webinar is part of a monthly webinar series that is organized by the Oregon Conservation Partnership. We use this forum for training and information exchange between soil and water conservation districts and watershed councils and land trusts in Oregon, but we are also open to the public. This webinar will be recorded and available on the Oregon Conservation website. We offer these by the support of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and we thank you sincerely for your support, OWEB. We have 38 people registered for the webinar today from a range of organizations, and we are happy to have you all join us. And in a minute, I'm going to hand it over to our presenter, Anthony Melithopoulos. But first, a couple of things. You are all muted by default, but to ask questions, you type it into your chat function that pops up on your screen, and I will read those questions out as they come or as Anthony pauses in his presentation. At the end, you have the option to ask questions using that method, or you can use the little raise hand function, and I can then manually unmute you and you can ask the questions yourself. In a few minutes, I will be uploading Anthony's slide deck to the presentation platform, so you should be able to download it and you can follow along on your own. And after the presentation, I will upload his slide deck to our website, so you can download it from there as well. Please share any questions that you might have as we go, and we look forward to interacting with you. Let's go ahead and get started. Anthony Melithopoulos is an assistant professor at Oregon State University in Health Extension in the Department of Horticulture. He has over 15 years of experience working together with commercial beekeepers and land managers to develop solutions for keeping bees healthy. Since 2016, he has been leading OSU's efforts to design, implement, and evaluate a statewide pollinator health program. He's on the coordinator team of the statewide Bee Protection Initiative, the Oregon Bee Project, and coordinates the Oregon Bee Atlas. And he's the host of a weekly podcast about pollinator health called Pollination. Additionally, I'm happy to announce that Anthony has agreed to serve as an affinity group coordinator through the Oregon Conservation Partnership, and he will be leading a networked community and ongoing discussion about pollinator habitats for watershed councils, land trusts, and conservation districts. I'm sure he'll talk about that more in his presentation, and we are really happy and lucky to have you here, Anthony. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I am going to try and share my screen and try and launch my presentation. How does that look?
Looks good.
I've got it the right way around? Excellent. Well, I see there's 17 of you out there. I know this this format is a little bit informal. I'd like to see you all and meet you all. Unfortunately, this is the most efficient way to do things, at least for the time being. And so today, I wanted to kind of get the work of the affinity group off the ground with a bit of a thought piece. Many of you may have seen me in the past speak, and there's some common slides. And that's just, you know, middle of summer, it's the best I could do. Many of you may have not seen these slides before, but my intent is more to just get the conversation started on how to bring the many pollinator initiatives that we have in the state together into something that builds from one initiative to the other. So what I wanted to do is 5 things today. I wanted to talk about the pollinator affinity group. Right at the outset, I'm going to have a link for how you can sign up. I then wanted to talk about, and for many of you, probably you don't need this refresher, what is pollinator habitat? With a heavy emphasis on bees, you'll learn that I'm sort of a bee-focused person, that we have Deanna from Such Land Trust, who's going to help us with monarch butterflies. 3, talk about the challenges to building pollinator habitat. I'm going to put some on the table. 4, they're kind of curated. I'm sure you have your own, and that I think will be kind of the focus of some of the first affinity group meetings, but I just wanted to put some ideas on the table for discussion. I wanted to talk about the Oregon Bee Project, specifically about its strategic plan, because it is coming up for revision, and in some ways I think the affinity group may be a great source of thinking about the pollinator habitat dimensions of that statewide plan, and then conclude with some thoughts and hopefully a much broader discussion with all of you on stitching together efforts.
Anthony, this is Vanessa.
Yeah.
Before you begin further, your slides are a little funny, actually, now that I look at them, because they are, we're not seeing the whole thing. The left side is cut off. I'm wondering if there's a way to shrink your slide so we could see the whole thing.
All right, let's try. So that doesn't help. That just, you see presenter view now, right?
Yes, that's true.
All right, sometimes you go back and forth and it fixes it. And if that didn't work, I'm going to stop sharing.
Take your time. There's always something like this.
And let's do, wrong. Okay, let's try this again. That's it. Let's see how this works. Okay, you can see it now. I'm going to launch it now. And how does that look?
It's still cut off on the left-hand side. I'm sorry.
No problem. Let's see if we've got a little shrinker button. I got these buttons here. Oh. Ah!
Now we can really read it. It's an eye test for all of us.
Well, I made it too big. I'm sure I can make it too small now. Let's try this. Okay. Okay, what does it give us here? Screen. Display settings. I'm going to end the show again and see if I can relaunch it on another page. Let's see, try this now. Okay, I'm going to try one more thing. Is that better?
Oh, that's it. You got it. You fixed it.
Really? Fantastic. Great, thanks. All right, so with all of these tasks in mind and with the presentation now operating as promised, let's talk about what the pollinator affinity group is. Now, as you know, Oregon Conservation Partnership has various affinity groups. There is a pollinator affinity group, and I've agreed to lead it, at least chair it. But the idea here is to be able to pull together many initiatives around the state, and kind of there are proposed focus areas. And I think at the first meeting we can revisit these focus. Oh, it's Amanda at Deschutes Land Trust. Sorry about that. So highlighting monarchs and the work that's been doing to help conserve, especially this Western population that's really been having some terrible problems. So trying to figure out what's going on around the state, and we've got Southern Oregon Monarch Association. There's groups in Central Oregon, Fish and Wildlife. So there's a lot of different people working on monarchs in the present time. Highlight bees, what land trusts are doing to help restore habitat and survey for native bee populations. One of the proposed focus areas is creating a summit or a meeting, maybe connected to another conference where we can see each other in person and strategize. Some of those strategies are going to focus on efficient ways of getting to restoration and also community engagement. These are all up for discussion, but at least I wanted to put these up here so that you had at least a glimpse of what the work would be done before I put this slide up, where I ask you if you want to join, you can take your phone and take a picture of that QR code, or if I had some, if I could copy this, I don't think I have the capacity. I will copy this link and put it in the chat. It's pretty easy. It's beeves/3ba, kind of like it's a sheep themed URL. If you fill that out, you'll get a little survey, and I will send this around afterwards as well and at the end of the talk. And this will allow you to give us your coordinates and we'll get you on to the next meeting. Vanessa, have I missed anything about the affinity groups? Anything you wanted to say?
Nope, you covered it, but I will paste that for you while you're talking, Anthony.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about pollinator habitat. When it comes to bees, bees are central place foragers like birds. They create a nest, and when they have that nest, they have to have access to forage over the course of their individual lifespan, and that's most of our bee species are solitary bees. So under the lifespan of that female, as she's building the nest, she's going to need food. But also we have a number of species, maybe 20% of our species are colonial in some way or form, and they don't reproduce until the colony matures, and so they're going to need foraging resources around that nest over the entire lifespan of the nest. Now, for butterflies, of course, this is more complicated. There is no nest, and often there are very long migration routes, and so it requires thinking in an almost more complex manner of space and time of where the butterflies are going to be. The butterflies don't really depend on the pollen as much as the bees do, but they do depend on plants that to rear their young on. And so in lieu of pollen, the butterflies are feeding on a host plant, and that host plant can often be nothing that looks like a typical pollinator plant. Here's the pine white, for example, in the Pieridae, and you'll see it nectaring on all sorts of all sorts of plants that bees will go to, but its preferred host plant doesn't have flowers at all. It's something like a ponderosa pine tree. And so it makes for a much more complicated kind of problem as compared to the bees. I will point out, though, if you haven't bought it yet, Volume 2 of Oregon Flora is tremendous. It really is wonderful when it comes to pollinators, especially the appendices. So if you go to Appendix 4, for example, there's been a nicely curated list of different butterfly species and their plant hosts. In addition, Andy Moldenke, the person who knows most about the native bees in Oregon, has an appendix with specialist solitary bees. So if you go to the back of the new chapter of Oregon Flora, it's there. Remarkable piece of work, and it's something that allows us to sort of fill out when we're thinking about habitat, what kind of plants we're talking about. Okay, now for bees, as I mentioned, there are a little bit, any questions on this or any points, or did I miss anything? I know I've got people on this call who are probably more knowledgeable about many of these things than I am.
No questions listed yet.
Okay. So bees, as I mentioned, require a nesting substrate. And so this is a great way to partition the bees up. There's a lot of different species of bees, but they vary. We have bees that don't look anything like bees. The bee in the bottom right-hand corner, the fairy bee in the genus Perdita, my taxonomist here at Oregon State showed me some samples that he collected up in the Wallowas, and I didn't believe they were bees. They're just so tiny. They almost look like a gnat. All the way up to, you see, we have one of our large bumblebee queens up in the top right-hand corner. So they vary in size. Some, like this red bee here, looks more like a wasp and is actually a parasitic bee. It actually doesn't build a nest. It's a cuckoo. Its sole purpose is to find nests of a very specific species to lay its eggs. They have a variety of different mouth parts, variety of different pile, and as I'm going to make the case, they have a variety of different habitat needs that we would have to attend to if we're going to do pollinator habitat work that sort of serves more than just the generalist typical bees that we find in Oregon. We think we have about 630 species, so it's much more speciose group than the butterflies. And one of the things that drives a lot of that species diversity is host plant specialization. 70% of these bees nest in the ground or are associated with bees that nest in the ground. The typical life cycle, I mean, there's a lot of variation here, and much of it's unknown, but it starts with a female digging a hole in the ground. Oftentimes, it's usually one female who starts the nest, and some bees, like our sweat bees, it actually turns into a colony. But for most of them, it's one female. She digs down a slender hole, and then she'll make chambers where she will mound the pollen that she's collecting from the landscape, lay an egg. She'll backfill that nest, die, and then for the rest of the year, those bees will eat that underground. They'll eat that pollen, undergo metamorphosis, and then wait for the right environmental cues to tunnel back out the following year. And sometimes they're very ubiquitous. You can find them in urban areas, these ground nesting bees. Here's my technician, Sarah Kincaid. Many of you probably know her because she used to work with Oregon Department of Agriculture. We're at a berm here down in Bandon in a cranberry bog, and we can just see there's a whole variety. Just exposing a little bit of soil is all that's required, and a specific type of soil to create a nesting bed for these bees. But oftentimes it doesn't require any special management. This is, I hate showing this because I'm always, you can hear me talking, but it's at Hoyt Arboretum outside of the zoo. This is National Pollinator Week. No, sorry, it says Earth Day. And you can see all the little mounds that are there. There's a female trying to get down in her nest, and really didn't really require much preparation. This is just a mowed lawn. And so sometimes this doesn't really require this part of the habitat is not that specialized, although some species have some very vertical banks, very specific soil types that they are keying into. 30% of our species, the other set of species, nest in above ground, and oftentimes they're using plant material with hollow stems or pithy stems to make their nests. And this is something that in restoration, in addition to planting flowers for bees, planting species that will actually create nesting opportunities is another dimension of habitat. Here you can see I'm in the Mid-Columbia region. There's one of our mason bees. It's quite a large group in this inside the up above ground nesting bees. She's collecting mud, and you can see what's going to happen on the left here. She lines the nest with mud. She then mounds up the pollen and then lays an egg, and then closes off the nest with another round of mud. This is typically in some kind of a hollow stem. Actually, wrong group. Especially up in the Mid-Columbia region, where I often see these bees nesting, is you have old oak kind of branches that have fallen on the ground. The beetles have burrowed in them. They've made a tunnel, and these bees will, after those tunnels are made, will go into them. They will nest in pithy stem, hollow stems as well. But I think in large parts of the state, kind of like wood that's had beetle burrows is a kind of preferred location for them. Any questions about the nesting part of it?
No questions yet.
Okay. The next part of this puzzle is when they make that nest, they'd have to have access to forage. And I think this is where many of you have focused most of your attention, and rightfully so. The bees require a great amount of pollen and nectar. Butterflies are going to require a considerable amount of nectar and host plant material. But it has to be there at the right time and at key points in the development time of these pollinators. For a bee, you can see all the rewards here in this brassica flower that I peeled back the petal. At the bottom of the plant, there's nectar that is welling up. That's a carbohydrate source. Both butterflies, bees, hummingbirds, our moth species will be consuming that nectar as a carbohydrate source. But the thing that's sort of the innovation in the bees is that they actually are trying to get the pollen off the flower, not for the purposes of increasing seed set, but they're doing it for the purposes of carting the pollen away and bringing it back to that nest. Here you can see a honeybee packed up with pollen on her back leg. She has special structures on her body to be able to get such large quantities of pollen back to the nest without it falling apart. Now, when it comes to habitat, one approach to this, and I don't think it's an unreasonable approach, is to get as much standing nectar and pollen on an acre of land as possible. Because, you know, for many species, they just need a lot of flowers. And if you can sustain a flower crop on a piece of land, you can really support a lot of bees. We've been doing research, real small scale research with some plants that are cover crop plants that are non-irrigated, that can muscle through the drought. One plant that fits this bill of like a pollen and nectar machine is Hubam white sweet clover. It's related to the sweet clover that becomes weedy, except it's an annual species. It's not a biennial species. And this plant can really, you know, hundreds of pounds of sugar per acre. And so you can really, and also a number of bees will be seen on this. There'll be honeybees, of course, but a number of native bees are also suited to plants in the bean family. We have a lot of specialists actually that specialize on plants in the bean family, and they seem to do just fine visiting an exotic species like this. But this story gets more complicated. Not all plants produce nectar. Here's California poppy. Poppies don't provide a source of nectar, but they're a great source of pollen. As you can see, this yellow-headed bumblebee just really making almost like a carousel, going round and round the poppy bowl, just stripping off as much pollen as she can. Lupins as well, a primarily pollen producing plant. They produce, if you watch a bee on lupins, they make this characteristic deep orange pollen, which bumblebees will work their way up the head and strip off pollen. So there's that complication. Not all plants provide nectar and pollen. The other complication is exemplified in this slide, which I've been using for 3 years. I apologize if you've seen it. You know, this is the 10th time you've seen it, but it's going to happen, you know, pretty soon now. Russian sage and black-eyed Susans planted together, such a beautiful garden element. The yellow and the purple look so beautiful together. But if you go up, walk up to this little garden bed, you'll notice the bees partition themselves. They're not the same bees. So when you go to the Russian sage, you'll notice the honeybees and bumblebees are almost entirely on the Russian sage. You also have leaf-cutting bees. That's that gray and white bee in the middle, almost entirely visiting this plant, and you don't see them at all on the Hersitella. On the Hersitella, you see a range of other bees. And one of the things that distinguishes these two groups of bees is their length of their tongue. So the Megachilidae are bees in the, you know, where the leaf-cutting bees and the mason bees are, have long tongues, as do honeybees, as do bumblebees, as do many bees that are in the Apidae, which is the group that the honeybees and bumblebees are in. And so they often will go to flowers that are a little bit longer corollas. Whereas the bees on the left all are short-tongued bees, and you can think, you just look at a black-eyed Susan, you can sort of walk over the pollen and get the nectar. It's very accessible. So sometimes tongue length partition bee, you know, that's one of the kind of key principles, is having plants that have conserved those different groups because you've got different length corollas. Great, I love this example. Currants, wonderful. Currants are so important for our long-tongued bees. Here you can see this is our California bumblebee, Bombus californicus on a currant, and you can see she's the only one who's got a tongue long enough to go down into that currant flower. Another bee that you'll have on east of the Cascades that I really love on wax currant is we have a Habropoda or Anthophora. It's a gray fuzzy bee that is extremely long tongue, completely keyed on to those flowers. And so tongue length often is one way that bees kind of partition out that, you know, sugar problem across the landscape. How, you know, how some bees will, you know, obviously a bumblebee has less competition on a current. She's the only bee that can get in there. And so each one of those florets are going to be full of nectar. Unlike a shallower flower, let's say at this time of year, something like a chokecherry that every bee can get their tongue into. And it, you know, the nectar, standing nectar sugar crop is going to be lower. But that's not where the specialization really ends. So there is this tongue length problem when it comes to being able to access the nectar. But pollen specialization is another matter, and it's where we really see the specialization. It's where a really good restoration ecologist can show their mettle, because you're paying attention to the bee fauna and the flowers that the flowers that produce pollen they can digest. So honeybees and bumblebees are known as polylectic bees. They can collect and digest pollen from virtually anything. They've evolved to be that way. They're social bees. They, you know, over time they're going to have to switch pollen sources because, you know, there's no plant that's going to bloom through the entire colony cycle. And so they've evolved to be very generalist in what they can digest. But we have a lot of bees in the state, and that's where in volume 2 of the Oregon Flora, you can look this up, that are known as oligolectic or monolectic. These are bees that can digest pollen from can only digest pollen from narrower sources of flowers species. So an example of an oligolectic bee, right now you'll see it if you have, in your backyard, you have sunflowers, or if you're going, you know, we're starting to see gumweed starting to bloom, you know, rabbit brush when it blooms, anything in that composite family. These bees are the genus Melisodes. They're also known as the long-horned bees. They are specialists. You'll never see them collect pollen off of another group of flowers. They really are specialized on a broad group of flowers of composites. And here you can see her collecting pollen. She's got a different kind of pollen carrying structure. Most of the bees don't have the kind of spoon shape that a honeybee and a bumblebee have on their rear leg, but have these brushy back legs that they just kind of like Velcro the pollen into. Another example of an oligolectic bee group are our diadasia bees. Diadasia specialize on cacti, but they also specialize, there's a group that specializes on mallows. And so their young can't really, I don't know if people have done the experiment, but they're really only going to collect pollen. And if you lack these in your plant community, these bees will not be there. Then we have extreme specialists, and we have a number of plants. Again, volume 2 of Oregon Flora kind of lays this out, that have extremely specialized pollen requirements. So Caliopsis, this little bee here, will only collect pollen off of Rocky Mountain bee plant. Now this starts to look a little bit more like the butterfly equation when you think about monarch butterflies. They only have one host plant, or a narrow group of host plants. With the bees, there's a lot of species that don't have that kind of specialization, and their young can feed on anything. But there are some that have, over evolutionary time, made tight linkages, and without that plant in the plant community, you're just not going to see these bees. And they may, if over time that plant is just doing poorly, you may lose that bee to the region. Okay, here, one more. Here's Diphoria on Campanula, another specialist. It's just a great picture. These pictures were taken by, again, our taxonomist here at OSU, Lincoln Best, another example. Okay, any questions before I move on to our next, challenges?
No questions.
Okay. I imagine you have your own list of challenges to creating pollinator habitat, and I struggle to sort of characterize. I wanted to make this organized, and so I may have to revise this, but I wanted to have 4. And so here's my 4. I don't know if they're a good 4, but maybe this is in the affinity group. I'm really looking forward to hearing what your 4 or 5 are. I would say the first one, and I am I know many of you are on the ground, have much more on the ground experience, and this may not be entirely true, but from my vantage point, it seems that we lack some plug and play practices, things that are really reliable, affordable, that a broader subset of land managers could sign on to do. And what I have in mind here is when I go to California, I can see an explosion of brassica being planted and legumes being planted in almond orchards as part of this program called Seeds for Bees. The almond industry is signed on to this. There's a nonprofit with funding that provides seeds for free. They've got all sorts of agronomic tech notes. The practice seems to be expanding and providing at least honeybees that are coming into California in late January, early February, a source of nectar and pollen, a little bit more diversity than what's available in almonds. And so they've got all sorts of resources. It's, concerns about cover crop and competition with almond pollination. They've got everything laid out. They're at the almond conference. You start to see things like Blue Diamond Almonds, huge co-op, signing on to these projects and getting their members involved. That's what I talk about when I think about plug and play practice, something that sort of has its own momentum and is moving. And when I think about nuts in Oregon, I don't know if we're moving. This is, during when we had rain, an almond orchard, new hazelnut orchard that's going in, and you can see there's no cover on the ground there. A lot of that soil in some of these places is going to be sloughed off, and it just seems like we don't seem to have the same level of kind of momentum. The question is like, why don't we? Now, if we have people on the call from Marion and Yamhill County, I believe, they have been doing a really good job of trying to get growers to sign on. You can see here a 75 to 100% cost share just for putting grass in those lanes to prevent that erosion, and a number of options available to growers. So it's not as though we don't have practices. The practices are there. I'm going to do some shameful promotion now. I'm actually working on this problem along with my collaborator Marcel Moretti, who's on the actual other side of the wall here in the room next door. And there you can also see Corin Peace from the Xerces Society. He's really a key person for NRCS and soil and water conservation districts in Oregon. He's based here in Oregon, in Portland, and sort of will travel around. And what Marcelo is doing, he's trying to think about how we can make this fit the production systems better. And he's planted out, I think it's 8 different wildflowers last year with pre-emergent herbicides to try and find a combination that would provide good weed control, but good wildflower establishment. Here you can see just a couple weeks ago, this is up near Independence. You can see what he did is he seeded the wildflower down the row, and then he has little plots where he used different pre-emergent herbicides, and now he's going to do post-emergent herbicides to see if he can keep everything clean. And also my job is to look at the nectar and pollen production. And some plants have done very well. The Gilia did really well in some of the spots. The Phacelia, the lacy Phacelia, Phacelia tenicifolia I always miss a syllable there, did extremely well. And what the plots basically involved was kind of going through, you can see at the bottom left, pre-emergent herbicide killed the grass and the Phacelia. On the right, you can see where the Phacelia didn't do so well and the grass came back. But there were some combinations that are being figured out where you can get good wildflower establishment in the orchard floor without very cost effectively. The other shameless plug I'm going to make, I think I'm limited my shameless plugs. But this is not actually my shameless plug. This is an NRCS plug, and there should be no shame around this. So, and this is something to keep in mind. So, as you know, NRCS, its conservation implementation strategies are determined at the the regional level. And so in the Mid-Columbia region, there was a successful CIS that went through for pollinator and beneficial insects. And to my knowledge, it's the first one that we've ever had in Oregon, so it should be celebrated. And the idea here was like trying to think about these commercial orchards, and at the bottom of this hill with the microphone, you can see Mike Omeg from Orchard View Farms, and trying to figure out where exactly to put pollinator habitat into the system. And one of the ideas is this stage right here, just before replant. There's a couple years where these orchards, they're trying to get the irrigation in, get everything together. They actually take the old orchard, they burn the trees up, and here you can see the, oh, can you hear that?
No.
Excellent, you can, excellent. It's an old narrated slide. So what you can see in the back here is an ash pile, and that's where the old trees were mounded up. And what happens here is that the CIS is helping support getting for the 3-4 years this is offline, getting pollinator habitat put in here. And as you know, what I found really remarkable about this is these are not native plants, and we did a lot of work in the oak fragments in the balsam root, limatium, astragalus plant communities that border here, and you would see a lot of those bees coming in here at pinch points and nectaring and gathering pollen. And so it appeared as though this was a good supplement, especially where there's oak conservation happening in step, that you have kind of like agricultural areas contributing to the health of the pollinators that are primarily in those oak sections. This is not a shameless plug for me, but this is, I think, I don't know if Marie is on the call, but I thought this initiative with Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District was quite remarkable. It's highlighted here. I have a weekly podcast called Pollination, and what Marie pointed out in that episode was, for pollinators mixes to work on county roadside. County roadsides, state roadsides has been a big target ever since the Obama era of we got to get more pollinator plantings out. Seems to be something that's difficult to accomplish. And Marie's approach was that the seed mix has to be inexpensive, and it can't be a big departure from the existing ditch maintenance protocols. And she also had this, and I think this is well put, that if it works in one county, neighboring counties are going to see it, especially if it looks good, and that might help it propagate. And so they did this great little trial right in the heart of grass seed country. What I really loved about it, they involved the, here you can see hydroseeding in some of the treatments. There you can see the scraped down kind of new construction area where they're putting the pollinator mix. And then they included Linfield College students to come by and assess the plot. So they had different seeding rates. Anyways, that's what I have in mind as different seeding rates in different species. And this is what I have in mind when I think about lack of plug and play practices. It's like having stuff like this go beyond this conceptual stage and seeing something like this get picked up across a county and then sort of spread over into the neighboring county, and still until a point where we maybe have, wouldn't it be great to have 4 or 5 installations as demonstrations in each of the major counties? We're not there yet. Okay, that's the first challenge. The second challenge is going to be more brief. Accounting for changes in habitat in the state. When a legislature comes and says, how are we doing? I hear Minnesota has done something. How are we doing? I don't think we can answer it. We don't really have an answer. And, we should be answerable. Here you can see NRCS, a document showing, focusing primarily on birds and things with backbones, but really being able to clearly demonstrate to stakeholders how things have gone when it comes to habitat over time. And I think I don't know how to generate that number. And maybe some of you have ideas. The third one is I think we still work with a very poor understanding of the connection between plant and pollinator communities. And we can't wait until we have a good understanding, but we're kind of hamstrung. We have to know that we're hamstrung, that we make decisions that may not necessarily be the most efficient ones. And this is my other shameless plug. I do see a flashing chat thing. Is there any, before I go into this detour, is there, Vanessa, are there any questions from the last or comments from the last part?
Nope, that flashing one is just me saying you're doing great.
Thank you. All right, so poor understanding of plant and pollinator communities, and I had a podcast earlier with John Asher, who's sort of doing the World Bee Project in Singapore, and he said, if we want to know what's happening with bees, we have to be a lot more specific. And what we lack is we don't have basic maps of where species live in relationship to habitats and ecoregions. We don't have, in the same way you pick up a copy of Oregon Flora and you have a rough idea where a plant species is, we don't have the same thing for bees. And it's exemplified in this really wonderful review of faunal level bee surveys that go back to the 19th century. The size, one thing they did is they cut off, there's been lots of bee surveys, but they cut it off at, you had to detect at least 100 bee species. So they culled off all the kind of minor studies to real serious studies of bee biodiversity. The size of the circle or square is the area that was surveyed, and the intensity is the number of bees detected. And what you'll notice is there are actually dots on the eastern part of the US, but they're pale because the bee biodiversity is in the West. All our bee biodiversity is in the West. And the other thing you'll notice is it really is in this area. You can see Nevada poorly surveyed, but you go into Utah, you go into southern Idaho, you go into California, there's a lot of bee biodiversity, and look what's missing in the middle here. Oregon, that eastern part of Oregon where we suspect there's a lot of bee biodiversity, has been poorly surveyed, so we don't even know what bees there are, let alone the plants that they visit. The last thing I want to mention is I think we suffer, and we're not the only ones, a lack of connection between initiatives. And this is an embarrassment on my part because I was hired in as I mentioned in a minute, as a way to try and facilitate and create infrastructure for different groups. And I think in this area, I've literally failed. It's been difficult for me to accomplish this. And I'm always, astounded at the different, whoa, is everything going okay on your side?
We're seeing some rocking and rolling. It looks like you got us back. We're looking at a stitching together slide with your 5 main points.
Oh, I see. Okay, we're on the wrong place. Here, let's just give me a sec here. Ah! We're almost.
It's not a good webinar unless there's some technology challenges.
Yeah, great opportunity for a question here.
While you're doing that, maybe what I will do is just talk a little bit about the affinity groups in general. I'll give you a second here, Anthony. Okay, the purpose of the affinity groups is to provide a place and a space for longer, sustained conversations that can cut across geographic boundaries and organizational type boundaries. So instead of at a conference where you're meeting up like, oh, I'm a land trust person meeting up with a watershed council person and we should go get a drink sometime, obviously that doesn't work very well in pandemic times. And so the idea is to have a dedicated time and space to advance conversations such that we can build knowledge collectively and get to know each other better and maybe build some lasting and deeper collaborations. That's the purpose. So the new affinity group that Anthony will be leading on pollinator groups is going to be joining 3 others. There's one on estuaries and tide gates. There's one on aquatic habitat restoration, which is a journal club, and one on protection of working lands and easements. All 3 of these groups have started to meet already, but the time is right to have new people join. I've posted the website so that you can see the contact information and how to get involved if you're interested. Okay, Anthony, did that buy you some time?
Yeah, it bought me lots of time. So what do you see now?
Okay. Now I'm seeing your slide number 1.
Oh, you are? That's curious. All right. Ah! Here, let's try this. Do that. And now what do you see?
Now I see you, you're not in presentation mode, but frankly, I think it's okay because you're getting towards the end of your slides.
Yeah.
And we can read them as they are.
Okay, great. All right, here we go. So you see strong regional initiatives?
We do, but if you can move it to one monitor view instead of two, that's ideal.
Oh. How do I do that?
There you go. Perfect.
Did I do it? I did something right?
You did something right. You did a lot of things right. This is a great talk.
Okay, we're in the right spot. You're strong regional initiative. Oh.
Now I can't see your presentation though.
All right.
I think you might have clicked out of it.
Yeah.
Folks, thanks for bearing with us.
No.
I'm sure you've all been on the receiving end of this.
Yeah, thank you everybody. This is great. I'm very sorry about this. Let's try this again.
That's okay. Take another second, Anthony, because I wanted to actually give a little more information about the other affinity groups. The Estuary and Tidescape group is going to be meeting next on July 27th. The Aquatic Habitat Restoration group is going to be meeting next on July 21st. And the Protection of Working Lands and Easement group is going to be meeting next on August 25th.
All right, how are things looking on this end?
Now I'm seeing a white screen. So you're sharing something, but I see your arrow. There it is.
Okay, great.
Strong regional initiatives.
Okay, great. All right, so I think what we've got here is, we've got a number of great initiatives that are going on. I've been really interested in the Understory initiative in Southern Oregon. Keeps kicking me out for some reason. I think I can. Well, let's see if this works. Otherwise, I'm going to just shut the PowerPoint down because we're at the towards the end, and I'll just talk. So we do have these great initiatives. Benton Soil and Water Conservation District, like East Multnomah and West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, have had very strong pollinator initiatives for years now. We've got the land trusts involved with things like the certified backyard habitat. So there's a lot going on, but they don't, in some ways, there's connections between them, but maybe not the kind of connections that would lead to address the challenges that I had listed above. Okay. Did the slide advance? Okay. Is now paused. Okay, I'm just going to stop the slideshow. I'm just going to show you my face and just take you through the rest of this. So the last two things I was going to talk about was the Oregon Bee Project Strategic Plan and also some ideas for stitching things together. And if you remember, the initiative in Oregon that created my position came about because of the bumblebee pesticide poisonings, the string of them that occurred in urban areas from 2013 to 2014. The legislature struck a task force, and out of that task force, there was a new law that was enacted in 2015, the Avoidance of Adverse Effects on Pollinating Insects law, which created my position, but also had me kind of tasked me to work with Oregon Department of Agriculture on a pollinator safety education plan. And when you read the legislation, it says pollinators, but it says honeybees and bumblebees. That's what's in the original legislation. So out of that, because I think in some ways it was the bumblebee issue that led it off, and it was not a monarch issue, which very well, if this had happened in the present, I think the position in the law would have looked different, much different. Now, out of this, meeting with our advisory committee, it was clear that what we needed was not a list of best management practices like a lot of states were doing, but rather a series of goals, a strategic plan. And so we had our first strategic plan, which is now expired, had 4 goals. 1, protect bees from pesticide exposure. The second one was to increase pollinator habitat. The third was to reduce impacts of diseases and pests on bees. And the fourth was to expand our knowledge of Oregon bees. And what we really realized as we looked through how we did on that strategic plan, the pollinator habitat was the weakest. We did really well. In fact, we lead the nation in terms of educating pesticide applicators on how to use pesticides around pollinators. It's been a real success story here in Oregon. We've done a great job at providing beekeepers resources for detecting pests and diseases in their colonies, and now more recently, opening up the capacity of looking for invasive bee species and some disease issues in the state. And we have, as many of you may know, and I'm not going to be able to get into this without the slides, we have a large scale, the only one of its kind in the US, native bee survey that allows, where volunteers are involved, they go out and we've been able to, I think we're up at 80,000 new records of bees in the state, and each one of those records has a plant host data point on it. And so I'll share the URL with you, but you can go on and you can actually, on a given week, I've done this with people, it's like, what's blooming, what are surveyors finding bees on this week, and they'll give you a readout of them. So it's a really useful resource. So we've done all this, and we're coming back and revisiting the strategic plan, and it was absolutely clear that what we were missing was some way of addressing the habitat problem. The last thing I'll say is we were also, many of you may know this, we produce thousands of postcards on, the Bees of Oregon postcards on how to manage pests in your garden, bees and forests. So we have a whole host of educational materials, and those people who do the survey, which numbers about 100, are spread across the state, can provide high-level education on bee issues and pollinator kind of bee biology and related issues in each of the counties. So what I was going to conclude on is that we have a current strategic plan, which what I'd like to get out of the affinity group is trying to work on that second goal of increasing pollinator habitat. Right now it says increase the amount of pollinator habitat in the state by 100 acres per year. And the second one is to provide land managers and the public with a greater variety of training opportunities that are coordinated across different agencies and nonprofits. And the activities that were proposed were to beef up our training to licensed pesticide applicators. 60% of the people who I talk to in licensed pesticide applicator training are vegetation management people, frontline workers. The other one was to develop some kind of curriculum for volunteers so that when volunteers enter our OSU extension programs or nonprofits or soil and water conservation district initiatives, they have some grounding. The third was to have some kind of online portal where we could report with common metrics how things are going in our counties. What are some of the initiatives? What are some of the success stories? And the final one was that we would have an annual meeting where soil and water conservation districts, land trusts, nonprofits, seed producers could get together and set some targets on either for state and federal grants, so money can flow out to different initiatives that could really use it, but also to see if there's some ways that we can get that kind of plug and play system that I was so excited about seeing starting to happen in California. Okay, that's the slides that are missing what they would have looked like narrated. It actually went a lot faster. And with that, I'd love to open this up for some discussion.
Well, Anthony, you did great. It's always hard to navigate these challenges as you go, and you got us all the information that you needed. And I think we know a lot more about bees in Oregon. and the context you're working in, and what it is you're trying to do, what your project is, and how we might fit in. So I appreciate the breadth and depth of your talk. Thank you. Folks, this is the time, if you have questions or items that you'd like to hear more from Anthony about, to go ahead and type your questions into the chat function of your toolbar that pops up when you join the webinar. I'll give you a minute to ask those questions, and I'm going to start off with one that's in the queue now. It says, might native generalists be adapted to native plants and be subject to some nutritive deficiency by accessing patches of non-native flora, even though they can't digest it? Does that question make sense to you, Anthony?
That's a great question. I don't know if we know the answer to it. I was thinking about this recently because, I see a lot of trefoil. I was going through the Plant Material Center's, if you haven't seen it, NRCS's Plant Material Center guide has some, how to grow out native seeds. And, I noticed that there's like 3 or 4 trefoils in that are native. And so I'm kind of like, I wonder if it's possible that there's a slight, they're attracted to the plant. They're super attracted, because the thing that you find on exotic trefoil is you'll find a whole lot of, megachilids that, you would see elsewhere. And I wonder if there is a kind of nutritional deficiency. It could also go the other way, where the plant is, providing more nectar and pollen. So you raised the great point. Attraction to something doesn't necessarily mean good reproductive outcomes. And I don't think there's enough information out there to know this. But I will say the one that we do know a lot about are bumblebees. And bumblebees do extremely well on exotic legumes. Not all the species, but the ones that we have that are common have been building up to some, the one thing that's quite remarkable about the agricultural area in Western Oregon is, for all, the intensity of the land use, there's some kind of patchwork going on where bumblebees are nesting in grass seed fields, they're starting on blueberry fields, and they're finishing on legumes. And the densities can be extremely high. And so I think you're right, there may be some, with generalist bees, there may be some problem associated with exotic plants. I suspect it's a lot less than we think it is, and but I don't know the answer, to be sure. A wishy-washy answer. Maybe somebody else has some. Unfortunately, you have to type in the chat. We can't just talk on this forum, which we will. Well, I guess with the affinity groups, we might have the same issue. But if you could just, somebody else has some thoughts, maybe just put it into the chat. It's like, no, there's this study.
Sure. And that's what the affinity group is for a robust discussion. So it all leads back to that, folks. Okay, can you point me to any documentation that addresses Eastern Oregon forest native pollinators?
Yeah, who's done a lot of work on this is Sandy DeBano. Well, Forest Service has done a lot of work. So Forest Service has been, surveying especially bumblebees. I think they've got, and they're gearing up now to do a lot more bumblebee work in the east of right across the Cascades, east and west, but on the east side. But Sandy DeBano at the Hermiston Research Center has had long-term projects in both the Wallowas, the Zumwalt, and the Starkey, right up just as you climb out of Hermiston, and has a really good data set on some of the bee plant associations out there. And she's been working on grazing. She's got specific research goals, but would have some ideas. And her grad student, actually, Scott Mitchell, I think he looked at shrubs specifically. So he looked at different shrubs and restoration areas and their utilization by different bee genera. It's actually, that's the work. So I would reach out to Sandy DeBano, DeBano, and ask her about her grad student's work on pollinator shrubs. I think it's, with all of this stuff, we have imperfect knowledge, but it's a pretty robust study in a very localized area. But I think probably a lot of those relationships are going to expand out across the East.
That's great. Okay, here's a question. For a municipality, what is the biggest bang for the buck in increasing habitat? Small native pollinator gardens or larger pollinator mixes on roadsides?
I'd love to have that conversation with whoever is out there. In the affinity group, we'll have that option. I don't know, because it's kind of like I've often struggled. It depends which municipality you're talking about. Like Burns, the amount of the benefit from restoration in Burns or someplace in the Grants Pass area is going to be disproportionately bigger than anything that happens in Portland. It's just because the Siskiyous and the eastern parts, the eastern high desert is really where the bee biodiversity is. But then there's this other element of engaging the public anyways, and kind of making sure that the initiatives across the state. I often think there's a division of labor here. There's a way in which people involved with work in Portland and Salem really motivate the work in the eastern part of the state. And if it's done properly, there's a kind of way in which our efforts could connect together. And then when it comes to roadside versus backyard habitat, you have so much more control and there's so much more revenue that can go into a backyard. I almost think that backyards, if one had to choose, would be easier. And the constraints, we've just started to talk with ODOT about this, and if people don't know, ODOT did have an arrangement. Maybe somebody's on this call from the coast. There was a citizens group that wanted to create a corridor, pollinator corridor from Wallport to Newport, I believe. And so they've got great GIS inventories of land. They've got a lot of land. And what they ended up doing was just kind of going through, figuring out, and there, of course, with silver spot butterfly, we have 3 listed butterfly species, and there was one in that area. It made a lot of sense, but they took the data layers, they figured out places, and then the community partnered with ODOT to be able to do that work. And I think that's because I think the roadside, the problem with the roadside is you've got like this highly visible area where, ODOT's prime lands may not be right next to the roadway. ODOT may have a big holding where it's, I'm thinking specifically about monarchs. Like they may have some quite large holdings where it would just make a lot more sense to go in and do a restoration project than on the roadside. The only other thing I'll say is it depends on what side of the Cascades you're on, because on the west side there's mowing, and on the east side there's virtually no mowing that takes place. And so your options for east side restoration seem to be better, and there's more bees and butterflies of concern out there. Well, maybe not of concern. We have lots of west of the Cascade concerned butterflies, but.
That was a great answer. It's really true. Okay, it seems like I don't hear enough about incorporating bee habitat into riparian restoration projects. Are there good references we could use in species selection? That is a great question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we rely a lot on Xerces technical notes within RCS, and I think they're always a good, there's the shrub guide that they have out there. And the problem, I think, is, well, that's not a problem. I think that's great because we have a starting guide, and NRCS and Xerces have worked hard to try and specify out the shrubs. And I think riparian areas, especially like a year like this, the riparian areas are where are big refuges. It's the only place where anything is green right now. And I just think riparian areas carry a lot of weight in what hopefully, unfortunately, probably is going to be the future. And so, but the problem with the guides is I think they're relying on the current level of knowledge about bee communities, which is, kind of, so there's a lot of great generalist plants out there, but I think where we could go with this in the future beyond what's currently available in those guides is kind of like thinking a little bit more deliberately about what's in that, what region you're in, and rather than, you may tweak a couple, you may tweak the shrub mixture a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to go a little bit more in this direction, even though maybe it's a little bit different from the original plant community, because I want to, there's a couple of species of bees out here, or a couple of butterflies that are having some difficulty, and just, the fragments are so small, it would be nice to just amplify that a little bit. That would be a great place to go in the future. But right now, the Xerces guides, they've got a hedgerow plant and shrub and guide, and I just feel that I am always nervous about this, because I know most of the people on this call probably have way better information than me on your question.
I'm going to ask you a question. This is coming from me, Anthony, on behalf of watershed councils. So a lot of watershed councils are working with private landowners when they are doing restoration projects, and they're also engaging the community at large on outreach efforts and general watershed health activities, trash cleanups and other types of activities. You said that you have a host of educational materials, and I'm wondering what in particular would you steer a watershed council towards if they wanted to engage a private landowner or a group of volunteers or a community meeting towards talking about pollinator health? Where would you ask them to begin, or what would you have them focus on?
That's been a group that we have not focused on. I deal with the public, I deal with licensed applicators, and we've just started to work with land managers, and they've largely been farmers, and largely farmers who have an interest in pollinators. I think it's an area where there's a real gap. I was on a call this morning with other extension faculty across the US, and I know one thing that they've tried in Minnesota is getting case studies out and trying to showcase, like, I think the idea was having like and maybe it's kind of like the California model, where you have a lock key system for, doing a very modest pollinator installation that's not like super expensive and super involved, and uses the equipment that you have there. Because I guess the thing is like, I'm thinking around your question, it's, maybe this is something for the affinity group to really tackle, is with this, wood landowner. I often have in my mind is that a Californian who's moved up here does not have a lot of experience with equipment, interested in doing something right, but needs a special skill set to be able to pull something off. And I haven't thought enough about that audience, and I suspect you have actually thought about that audience a lot more. And it would be nice to kind of like, because I think I've heard this from Benton Soil Water Conservation District as well, that they have a lot of these landowners, either it's an easement or something, but they just want to put something in, and they just want the, because we all have run into the very enthusiastic landowner who will spend any amount of money and do whatever, and then show up at every meeting. But these people who sort of knock on the door once and just want something they can implement pretty quick and see some successful results. I wonder if that's something to work on as the affinity group, try to figure out if there's a pathway to that.
Well, it is exciting to identify the gaps of where things need to be worked on and where there's room for collaboration. So looks like we found one of those areas. That is the end of the questions in my queue. I want to give our audience members a time, just a second. If you have any other questions, now would be the time to ask them. Anthony, when do you anticipate the first meeting of your affinity group will take place?
Yeah, I would like it to be, we want to kind of get something in the next 2 weeks, have our next meeting. And what I'd like to do is the link is still up there. If you have not filled out the form, please fill it out. You'll get an email from me after this and a doodle poll. And I'll put some dates down, and hopefully from there, within the maybe early next week, we could set a date, and then we can move from there.
Okay, this is great. I'm okay with ending early. That's always a good thing too. And this was a great talk, Anthony. Thank you for your time and expertise and effort. And we look forward to having this conversation move further down the field.
Yeah,
Everyone, I just want to say that the recording will be available on the Oregon Conservation Partnership website along with Anthony's slide deck. So if you're curious about those slides that you missed, you can click through and find them.
Yeah, and Vanessa, the other thing I might suggest is it might be helpful for me if you haven't filled the form out as you move through as you go through the questionnaire. If there's like topics like that have come up in this back and forth that you think are really you'd like to discuss, add it into the chat, and that'll help structure the agenda for the future meetings.
Great. Okay, that's it, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Okay.